Let's talk a little bit about borders. You will not be getting fabric for your border. You will need to buy it. The borders are cut at 4.5 inches. So if you are doing your borders on the crosswise grain, then a half a yard, as long as it's cut straight, will do it. That would get them exactly. Now, if you're doing a quilt that you're going to enter in a show, or you want to make sure it stays absolutely square, you are better off cutting your borders on the lengthwise grain. And we haven't talked a lot about grain other than the bias. The lengthwise grain runs parallel to the selvage, and those are the warp threads in a loom, and they don't have as much stretch as the weft threads. That's the ones going on the crosswise grain. For my purposes in this quilt, it's small enough. I'm not really worried about it stretching out, so I'm going to go ahead and cut 4.5 inch strips on the crosswise grain. Because I'm using a little mat for the camera, I actually have this folded in 4 parts. That is dangerous. If it's not absolutely straight, then you can get little jags on your edges, and you can get little V's. So as usual, I am clean cutting the edge, and then I'm going to flip it over and cut 4.5 inch strips. And this is just the same as cutting any other that we've done. So I'll just cut 4 of them. I did seriously consider adding a small inner border to this quilt. It does not call for it. I thought about a 1 inch one, but I decided once I had chosen this blue fabric that it didn't need it. The tendency of most people when they are first starting out is to just cut strips for their borders that are longer than the edge of the quilt, sew them on, and then cut them off to size. If you do that, I can almost guarantee that your quilt will end up out of square. So what you need to do is measure your quilt in 2 or 3 places, and I put down 2 measuring tapes this time. I don't usually use 2 different ones. And hopefully your measurements are going to be close. The pattern says to take the smallest of these measurements and cut your borders that length. I usually average my measurements and cut them that length. For my purposes today, we're doing the side borders first, and 34.5 inches is what I'm getting on my measurements, and it's almost the same in every place that I measured it. So that's what I'm going to cut my borders to, is 34.5 inches. If I have a ruler long enough, then this is how I measure long pieces for whether it's sashing or in a block or a border. Half of 34.5 is 17.25. So I have folded my border strip in half and made sure that the cut edges are together, and then I line the 17.25 mark up on the fold edge of the border and cut off the other end. So there I have my 2 side border pieces cut to length. I will take them to the sewing machine, right sides together, and sew a 1/4 inch seam. And I want to make sure that my top edge and my bottom edge match. If there's any extra, then I want to ease in on whichever part has a little extra. There shouldn't be if you were accurate while you were sewing all the pieces together. I stitched the border onto the sides of the quilt, and I just want to note that I did stitch with the quilt side on top and the border on the bottom. That way I could see, so I wasn't chopping off points on flying geese or half square triangles. So now we're going to repeat the process, and I measured in 2 spots that you can see, 2 or 3 spots, either average or take the smallest measurement. I got 42.5 in one spot and 42 3/8 in another, so I'm pretty close again. So I will cut my borders. I won't have to cut much off. So I've measured. I'm going to cut and add the top and bottom borders. Okay, I added the top and bottom borders. Again, I sewed with the quilt side up and the border side down on the machine. I chose blue for my border. That does not mean you have to. Usually whatever color you choose for your border, that is what the quilt becomes. It becomes more of a blue quilt, or a red quilt, or a green quilt, or a brown quilt. I did audition several different fabrics, and Many of them would have looked great for the border. I just happen to like blue, and I think it frames it out and just stops everything. I am going to bind it in red though, so I carry on that Americana theme.